Hi, I'm Stacy and welcome back to the channel. We all have that childhood book or author whose stories stick with us long into adulthood. For me, R L Stine is one of those authors, and the Goosebumps series was one of my favorite series as a kid. A couple of years back, I watched the author's masterclass over on the platform Masterclass, and I loved it. Up to date, there are 230 Goosebumps books that have been published, and more are still going to be published. The first one was out in 1992, and that means since 1992 he has managed to keep an interested audience for his series, and I think that's very impressive. I didn't even exist when the first book was being published, so it blows my mind how he has managed to achieve so much success. The masterclass shows you the behind the scenes of how he writes his books, and getting to see that process was so fun. It was also very insightful, and it brought back a lot of nostalgic feelings. So once I was done with the class, I made a mental note that I was going to read the books as an adult, and late last year I finally got to it. This is gonna be a short and sweet Goosebumps review of 3 books, which are Say Cheese and Die, Night of the Living Dummy, and Return of the Mummy. That kinda rhymes, doesn't it? On to the first book, which is Say Cheese and Die, and this happens to be the first ever book to be published in 1992. We are following some neighborhood kids who break into an abandoned building. They find a camera that they more or less steal, and it turns out the camera has some pretty scary features. Every time they use it, something bad happens, and by the time they realize that it's the camera, the damage has already been done. So now they have to figure out how to fix the problems that have come from using the camera, and they also need to figure out how to destroy the camera, which seems to be indestructible. On top of that, the owner of the camera, who happened to be squatting at that abandoned building, figures out that it's the kids who stole his camera, and he does some pretty sketchy stuff in order to get his camera back. In terms of scariness, this had some pretty scary themes, but only because as an adult I can decipher that if this was happening in real life, it would be a pretty dangerous situation. But if I'm to take the story as a whole and look at it just as the story, I was not scared at all, because I can reason out that a camera can only do one thing, and that is take videos or pictures, and that's it. It cannot do any of the weird stuff that the story tells us the camera is doing. For a children's book, this had some surprisingly dark themes, which you probably will only pick up if you're an adult. For starters, I thought it's a rule that death is not explicitly mentioned in kids' stories, but in this book someone actually dies. And the time I was reading this, I was also watching Avatar: The Last Airbender, and if you watch that show enough times, you notice how they go to such great lengths to avoid directly mentioning death in the story. So it was so funny to just see how Avatar avoids death at all costs, while this book had an actual death happen, and that was also interesting. Since this is the first Goosebumps book ever, I'd say it was a solid start to the ongoing series. I can see why it got picked up by publishers, and I can also see how it did so well once it was out. In terms of scariness, I'd give it a 2, because as an adult it was really hard to suspend belief and buy into the idea of a camera doing scary stuff. Overall, I'd give it 3 stars because it is a decent, engaging children's book. After I read the first book that was ever published, I decided to read one of the most popular books that ever came out, and that book is Night of the Living Dummy. This follows the story of kids who are twin sisters, and they happen to find a dummy at a construction site. I think this book became so popular once it was published that a bunch of sequels were released after it. Lindy is a sister that found the dummy, and Chris, who is her twin, at first is not really interested in the dummy, but then Lindy starts doing skits in front of their friends, in front of parents, and in front of anyone who will basically listen to her and watch her. And eventually her skits become so good that she starts getting small gigs to go and perform. For example, she is hired to perform at a birthday party, and I think she's hired to perform at a school event of some sort. Once her twin Chris sees the popularity that Lindy is garnering, she also decides that she wants her own puppet. So she basically throws a bunch of tantrums until her parents cave and decide to get her own dummy. As you guessed it, once there are two dummies in the house, weird things start happening, and the kids are the first to realize it. And when they try to tell their parents, of course their parents do not believe that the dummies are doing anything bad, so they are stuck with dummies that they believe are evil in a way. Reading this book, I think I realized where R L Stine gets his ideas to portray problematic characters, or the characters that are antagonists in his stories. And I think he gets some of his ideas from people who would be problematic people in society, and perhaps people who belong in jail because they are actually dangerous. So the dummy in the story is the antagonist, and it was written to be evil, so I think that was okay. But then we also have the twins, and R L Stine included a lot of sibling rivalry between the twins, and I think how it was written, it was kind of scary, even from the perspective of an adult reading this book, which is meant to be a children's book, because in real life, I think if I saw my kids, if I did have kids, behave like that towards each other, I would start to question whether they are sociopaths or psychopaths, because the kind of behavior that they exhibited was a bit cruel. No, not a bit, it was very cruel and kind of disturbing to read as an adult if you understand certain things like psychopathy or sociopathy. Okay, maybe psychopath is a bit too dramatic, but honestly, some of that behavior seemed like behavior that would come from a sociopath. In terms of scariness, I would give this a 4. I think the writing was very effective. I mean, I wasn't shaking in my boots, but I could see how this is meant to be scary and how it is scary in terms of how the narrative is written. Overall, I'd give this book 4 stars, and it definitely is one of the most popular books for a reason. And for the final book, I chose something that was about going on an adventure, and the book that I chose was Return of the Mummy because it is based in Egypt and the main character had to travel there. We follow Gabe, who on his school break goes to visit his uncle and cousin in Egypt. His uncle is an archaeologist and he is currently working on unearthing a tomb that belongs to an Egyptian prince. The tomb is surrounded by a lot of superstitions and a lot of warnings, such as if you disturb the resting place of the prince, you might end up getting cursed or you might experience something horrible. This book started off to a very slow start and I was kind of bored. Yeah, I was very bored in the beginning, but towards the end, and I do mean the end, a few pages, the book does pick up as we get to the climax of the story, and from that point it's very interesting. It does hold your attention and you are desperately wanting to find out what happens. But I will say, out of the 3 books that I read, this one felt like it had a healthy portrayal of a villain, at least for a children's book. The villains in the rest of the book felt like they belonged in jail if they existed in real life, because that's how dangerous they are. But this one felt okay. If you haven't guessed the plot twist, it is literally the title of the book, Return of the Mummy. So they of course will disturb the resting place of a prince and he will come back to life and try to exact revenge. So because of the storyline, I could not suspend belief and get into the story of a mummy coming back to life. So for those reasons, I'm gonna give it 2 stars in terms of scariness and an overall score of 3 stars. And that is the last of the R L Stine books that I read. And initially I had planned on reading 10 books, but I soon realized the nostalgic feelings that I have for these books does not exist when I try to read them as an adult. So to be honest, they put me in a reading slump and I decided to stop and leave the memories that I have of these books as positive memories of my childhood. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you're interested in bookish content, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Also tell me, what were the books you read as a kid And do you think you would like them now as an adult?